This video is intended to give you a bit of a perspective on changing out a Jeep Wrangler JLU clutch in a garage, a two-stall garage on the floor. And this is actually in the middle of winter as well. So it kind of gives you a look into how long this takes. It took me 7 hours to complete this change. I've done it in as short as 5.5 hours. Realistically, it takes about 2 hours, maybe 2.5, to get the transmission off. The key to this is having all of the tools you need ready under the Jeep, so you're not constantly getting up, looking for the right tool, and then coming back again. If you look at the comments, there is a link to a Jeep JL web forum that gives a list of the tools that you need that will get you mostly through the job of taking this all apart. The impact wrench really does help. The previous one was taking the bolts off of the transmission mount. And this, we're taking off the rear drive shaft. One cool trick is if the back tires are up on jack stands, then all you have to do is kick the tire as long as the transmission's in neutral and the parking brake is off, and it spins that drive shaft around so you can get to all the bolts. I use a little swivel adapter on the impact to make that happen. This here is showing that you need to lower the gas tank so you can get that cross member out of there. So you have to take out a couple of bolts on the gas tank and drop it down. As you go out through this entire project, you're gonna be looking for the fastener that you missed. There's some wiring on this passenger side of the transmission, and there's also the fuel lines that run along it. There are various little plastic grommets that hold the wiring on, as well as brackets that hold the fuel lines on. In this picture, you can see we remove the cross member. We're holding the transmission up. We remove that exhaust pipe, and now we're just kind of repositioning this so that we can get this transmission mount off of here. And now that that cross member is out, you can get the front drive shaft disconnected from the transfer case as well. Just using some zip ties to be ready to hold the drive shafts up and out of the way. I do not take them fully out. I just disconnect them from the transfer case so that I then zip tie them up and out of the way so that they stay off the floor and out of my way. Now we're removing the transmission mount from the bottom of the transfer case. We're trying to expose the 7 13mm bolts that go around that connect the transfer case to the transmission. You'll notice that there's several times where I do not support the transmission / engine / transfer case with any sort of jacks. I just let it hang. I kind of need it to droop down that far in order to reach the top of the bell housing and some of the brackets on there. Getting these 7 bolts off is kind of a pain in the butt. There's a sensor above the transmission that needs to be unplugged. There's also the fuel line here that needs to be unplugged as well. On top of the transfer case, there's a 10mm bolt with a bracket that holds these cables down. You have to remove that. I use a flathead screwdriver to pop off the actuator for the transmission case. I'm using a Harbor Freight 450-pound transmission jack. It does okay. You'll see I use some various tricks to make this work better. Getting these 7 bolts off around the transfer case is pretty tricky. There's not a whole lot of space to work with up there. I actually have a 13mm wrench that I cut in half so I could get it up there and have it be short enough. Now, as you're dropping it down, just make sure that it stays balanced on the jack, as well as just take a look to make sure there's no cables or electrical sensors that are still plugged in as you bring it down. and steady it out of the way. This Jeep is on jack stands, both the front and the rear, and the tire's about 2 inches off the ground. This gives you enough clearance to slide that transfer case out of there. That's the slave cylinder. There's a bracket up here that needs to come off. Do not take off that bracket that holds the cables for the shifter linkage. We're going to leave that attached the entire time. The most difficult part of this entire job is this top 2 bolts on the bell housing. There is a bracket that is part of the bolt that is over towards the passenger side, and so first you have to take the nut off, then you lift the bracket off of the stud, and then you have to take the bolt out. And so I do this by sticking my head up in this space with a bunch of extensions on a ratchet and taking those top 2 fasteners out. Once you take the nut off, though, you have to take 2 other bolts. The next stud to the right, to the passenger side, needs to come off as well. And then there's a third bolt that bolts into the top of the transmission that needs to come off in order to slide that bracket off so you can get to the actual stud. I don't know how I'd do this if I left the transfer case on, because I can't quite access it or see what I'm working on. I also have to stick my hand up the right side, the passenger side of the transmission, and try to manipulate things up there as well. That is by far the most difficult part of this entire project. Right now I've got the top bolts still in place because I didn't want to drop the transmission. And so I'm putting the jack in place. Then I'm going to loosen up and remove that top bolt. I think I still got a couple bolts on the bottom that are holding it in place, but then once that's done, I'm continuing to check to see if I removed everything. And so that's going to be just your wires and your brackets. So as you lower this down, look around, get out, and try to see if it's hanging up on anything, if you missed anything here. I've been using the manual ratchet on this jack because the impact wrench makes it go too fast and kind of jumps up and down. But you could totally drop the transmission on this thing. So be careful, hold it, make sure it's balanced and in place. And up there in the top left, it was a cable clip that I had not undone. Bringing it down, it's going to just stay on this jack as you change out the clutch itself, because we're not going to disconnect the shifter cables from it, because that will ruin the alignment of them. You can see the clutch up in this view here. We're just going to pop it out using an impact wrench and get that out of the way. I did a quick inspection on it, and it looks pretty good. This one has about 30,000 miles on it. Make sure you don't breathe in the dust. This is the bad dust. I'm taking 120 grit emery cloth and cleaning up the face of this flywheel. I also spent quite a bit of time cleaning up the input shaft of the transmission. This has to be spotless. Center Force no longer recommends adding lubricant to this, and there's just a dry lube that's already on the clutch disc that's going to be used. The other thing that's kind of important here is you take your clutch disc and you run it on top of the spline just to make sure that feels as smooth as possible. You want to make sure there's no burrs or anything that could impede the movement of that clutch disc. This is the Center Force internal slave cylinder. I put it in place, torque it appropriately, route the hydraulics outside of it. I really like that slave cylinder and the internal slave. In this, we are starting to route some of the items that could potentially be in the way. We're going to put the clutch in place and start to thread in each of these clutch bolts. As you get those bolts in, you're going to put this clutch alignment tool inside of it. That's going to be key throughout this whole process. And then using a star pattern, we're going to slowly start to tighten these bolts. Centerforce recommends a star pattern, and once things start to get tight, they recommend a quarter turn at a time. And what this is doing is it's just slowly compressing the springs within that clutch such that it compresses the plate to the flywheel. Periodically, we're going to check that tool in the middle to make sure that it slides in and out and that's aligned. Here's a quick trick. I use a flathead screwdriver to hold the flywheel in place as I torque each bolt to the appropriate 35 to 38 foot-pounds of torque. After that, I'm going to do even more work to move anything out of the way that could impede the bell housing going back on. The bracket that holds the fuel lines is always key, and in this image, the pink arrows show the 2 tabs that you have to clear to get out of the way. I'm also using 2 bolts with the heads cut off to help align the bell housing. This helps with the jack that I have. You can kind of align those bolts into some holes on the bell housing and then use the jack itself to try to get the angle correct as you push the transmission onto the engine itself. I am using, again, the ratchet on this Harbor Freight jack to try to get things appropriately lined up. Be careful not to drop the transmission. Once you get this transmission starting to line up, the key here is you continually check to make sure there's nothing that's getting pinched. You do have to compress that internal slave cylinder a little bit. I did not put the fittings on it, so it can compress without any pressure against it. But throughout this whole process, you're going to be looking for, say, the starter wiring that gets in the way, as well as that bracket on the very top. I do use a couple of bolts. This is one of the bolts from the starter, which is on the other side of the bell housing, but it's longer, and so it can help to start to draw the bell housing onto the engine. Again, being very careful you're not pinching anything in there. And then we're going to slowly use these bolts to draw the system together. Once that is appropriately torqued and in place, then it's putting the transfer case back in. This is one of the easier steps, I'd say. This jack does a nice job of getting the transfer case in place, and I'm going to use the same cutoff bolts to help align the bolt holes, and then I'm going to use the jack itself to get the angle correct such that it slides on. The spline shafts just slide together. You can kind of see that stud in place in that picture. In this one, you can definitely see it. We're going to try to manipulate it to get those aligned, and then I'm going to actually lower the jack here to try to get the angle correct so that it just slides into place. I've got a couple of those bolts ready, the 13 millimeter head bolts, that we can kind of secure this in place once those splines slide in together. Perfect. Make sure you get the appropriate brackets right in place and torque these down to the appropriate values. There's no room to get a torque wrench up there, so just kind of have to guess. But that bracket
Don't forget that bracket there. The rest of it is easy. This is now bleeding. I'm using a vacuum bleeder to bleed out the clutch system. You're going to put everything back the way you originally took it out and pump the foot pedal quite a few times to get it working correctly. And now you've got a new clutch.